Welcome to the Blind Apex Podcast, where amateur club racers tune in to get faster.
I'm your host, Con John Turk, and on this episode, we're talking about the big baller goodness you stuff under your wheels. We're talking big brake kits. Joining me to discuss this topic, purveyor of Evo and Civic parts, the gentleman I collaborated with on the big brake kit on my 8th gen Civic, Austin Getz from Wonderladen Racing. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Con. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a while since you and I talked. I think we sort of didn't exchange emails after we got the kit to fit, right? And I've just been running hard.
I was going to say, I think after we kind of got the kit wrapped up and fit on your car, it probably wasn't until you won our giveaway track day back in December.
Yeah, which I absolutely abused on.
How did that go for you?
So everybody chickened out because the forecast wasn't as positive as they wanted it to be. It wasn't that great in the morning, but I still went out. You got to learn on all conditions. So I went out when it was, I don't say the R word, so it was just moist out.
Gotcha.
And I went out on slicks because that's all I own.
Ooh,
so I don't
brave.
I don't own RA1s. But you just go out and you do what you can do. There's plenty of other people. We give each other space. The other people that were out there were basically doing the same thing. Second session, we went out, and things were getting drier. So towards the end of that session, we started putting in some hot laps, and then session 3, 4, and 5 were all good to go. And then the rest of the weekend was perfect, which it was supposed to be wet all weekend, but it wasn't. So,
well, there you go. So you run your car in Honda Challenge, is it?
Yeah. So I run it in Honda Challenge H2.
Do they have like only specific allowed compounds for Honda Challenge? I'm not really familiar with how the rules are.
No, the world is my oyster for race compounds. I'm limited to a by 8 wheel, so an 8-inch wide wheel. Let's see. It's a basic bolt-ons car. For the people who are listening, if you need to know more specifically about my car, we did a restricted prep overview a couple episodes ago. Go look for it. But essentially, it's coilovers, brakes, sway bars, intake header exhaust, and your safety equipment. And your 8th gen Civic, your restricted prep is done.
Gotcha.
You can do aero, so you bolt on a splitter. You can't bolt on for our cars. Nobody makes a kit. You sort of retrofit a kit, and then Johnny at 9 Lives will make you a wing. He's got plenty of those. So Swan necks, standards, whatever you want, he'll make it for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if enough of you guys bothered him, you could probably get him to make you a splitter too. Funny enough, actually, you were kind of mentioning earlier, like, go into how you kind of got into racing and what kind of started the company. That's actually where Wonderladen started, was with me doing aerodynamics. I started with doing splitters specifically for Evos. I had a huge template put together where, customers would tell me what they want for length, what kind of diffusers they want in it, if they want mounting brackets or not. And it was nice. I felt like it was a very refined package, but unfortunately, shipping full-size splitters is cumbersome.
Oh yeah.
So that kind of killed it before I ever really took it anywhere. Every now and then I'll still have someone reach out to me, "Hey man, do you still make splitters?" And if they're local, I'm kind of willing to do it still, but if they're not local, I just kind of tell them, yeah, you might want to go to 9 Lives or one of the other companies that's kind of made a name for themselves in the past few years for grassroots aerodynamics, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, I can't imagine shipping a blade. I'd tell them, I'd probably make them a really nice template, like a cut template. But
Yeah, I've done that a few times too, where I'll either send them like a digital copy of a template and they can go to FedEx Kinko's and get it printed off, or just ship them a paper copy of the template. And that kind of worked okay, but people, there's different motivation levels to do your own work, and
especially
it's
splitters.
Yeah, definitely with splitters, it still takes a fair amount of work just to make it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it came to the point where really the only way for me to not lose all the money that I was making selling the splitter through shipping was through Greyhound. And so it was like this whole process of I'd have to throw the splitter, I'd have to box the splitter up into effectively like a flat screen TV moving box, put it in my truck, drive downtown to drop it off at a Greyhound station. And when I started doing this stuff, this was like right as COVID started becoming like a serious thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just, it didn't work. Like, long story short, it wasn't a viable business solution. So from there, I guess I could probably rewind a bit further back. I bought my Evo in 2017, and I'd always wanted an Evo. Like, growing up with the Fast and Furious and Forza Motorsport 2, like my favorite car to drive in that game was the HKS CT230R, and I just had this fascination with Mitsubishi Evos. And in 2017, I was finally at a point in my life where I could afford one, and the right one came up for sale, and that's the car that I still have today. Unfortunately, nowadays most of them are coming up on being 20 years old. All the companies that made parts for them back in the day don't really make parts for them anymore. Over the years they get crashed and there's just less of them out there. So it's a very small market. So I found myself in a position of, hey, I want this part, or I need this part, and it either doesn't exist or they're too hard to find. And I've been designing parts at this point for 3 or 4 years for just kind of myself. I was like, well, I have the capability of designing my own stuff. I'll just do that and figure out ways that I can get it made then from there. And that kind of birthed the idea of Wonderladen. I didn't actually file for my LLC until 2020, or maybe it was 21. I don't remember. But early on, I was fortunate enough that I had some help with from a friend, Dallas Cutler over at SSB Designs. He gave me a lot of guideline, not necessarily, I wouldn't say guidelines, but just input and his own opinion on some of the stuff I was designing, which really helped me figure out how to do things better. Designing stuff is easy, and especially nowadays with additive manufacturing, 3D printers and all that stuff, it's really easy to design a thing that does the job. But when you start talking other forms of manufacturing, like sheet metal or mills or lathes, where you have subtractive manufacturing, you have to consider your design. There are constraints with what those processes can do. So having someone that had experience with manufacturing and being able to give input of like, oh, well, this could be designed better for if you're making it on a mill, standardize certain features, radiuses and stuff like that to reduce tool swap over changes, stuff like that. Right. And that kind of just went like that for a few years, just kind of like doing things myself. And then sort of around the time I filed for my LLC is kind of when more people were coming to me like, hey, like, I see these things you're doing, like, I'd like one for my car, and so, okay, like, instead of getting like 1 or 2 of things made, I'd get 5 or 10. And it kind of just grew to the point where my friends that I've known for about 10 years who are now my business partners that were my manufacturing source said, hey, you know, like, why don't we just buy into your company and then, you know, like, we can help you push that further along. And, right. You know, it's the other side of it too is, you know, it's less bootstrapping for me. You know, I'm fortunate enough. I've never had to take out a business loan. I just kind of paid for everything out of my own pocket, which definitely hurt the first few years. It still hurts now. I still pay for a lot of prototypes myself and stuff like that. And now actually I just sent some files to my business partner today. There's still some stuff where it's not quite a viable product that I think we can put on the market and sell on a regular basis, but there's still stuff that I want to do for myself. And, you know, if there's enough friends that are interested that want to buy in as well, I'll get a handful of stuff made. But that's kind of how the company came about, was like, I need things for myself, and then other people just kind of saw it and they wanted it too, which is cool. It's gratifying. I think one of the things I really truly enjoy is being able to solve the mental puzzle of, hey, there's a thing, right? There's something wrong with my car, or there's this space that I'm trying to fill with a part. And, you know, it's this mental puzzle of, what does that part look like in your head? Okay, go to the computer, design it, and then get the thing made. You know, nowadays, prototyping is made way easier with 3D printers. So I'll go through, you know, 1 to 10 revisions in plastic to make sure it fits how I want it. And then we'll get prototypes made in metal. And, yeah, that's generally kind of how the design process goes for most parts, not all parts, but most. And then shortly after my business partners bought into the company, going back to kind of the whole thing that got me started, well, you know, I didn't really think it was viable to start and grow a new business making parts for cars that are a niche market that are also 20 years old. So I kind of took a step back and said, okay, we need to look at other markets. What's a relatively newer platform that we can get into making parts for that isn't totally a flooded market already? And I ended up picking the 10th gen Civic platform. And we looked, it kind of came down to either doing 86 parts, like the first gen 86s, or BRZs, FRSs, and the 10th gen Civic. And ultimately what led me to the Civic is just the fact that it's still, I wouldn't say it's an untapped market, but when you compare it to like golden era Hondas or like 8th or 9th gens, there are still considerably less big names making parts in those markets. So like if you look at the BRZs, FRSs, you know, they've got any big name company you can think of probably makes parts for those cars. And we still do want to do parts for those cars. It's going to happen at some point, but to be a new company and try to make your name competing against all of those big names is just such a mountain to climb. Even in the 10th gen community, it's been just this enormous push of you have to be able to market things well, and you know, you have to have a social media presence, and it is you know, this isn't my day job, right? I have a full-time job doing CAD design at General Motors. Like I can only, unfortunately, have 24 hours in my day, and I've got to choose wisely how I spend them.
Yeah.
So
I know how that is.
Sorry.
No, I know how that goes.
Yeah, you know, it's just it's yeah. I mean, anybody that's you know an adult, or I mean, hell, I'm not even an adult, but anybody that's in the adult world, you know, knows that struggle. Yeah. But one of the products that I quickly decided that we were going to do shortly after we decided we were going with the 10th gen Civic is a big brake kit, because there was just a lack of, I mean, there's good options out there. but there wasn't something that I felt kind of filled the area that we fill with our kit, which is basically, an affordable cost of entry with good capability that gives the consumer control over their costs to keep the kit on their car, right? So how much are pads, how much are rotors, what are their options for pads and rotors, right? And with a lot of other kits out there, you kind of get shoehorned into, well, their kit comes with 2-piece rotors, and when you need replacements, you have to go to that company to get replacements from them, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But, if push comes to shove, right, let's just say we're in another COVID era or, manufacturing delays happen, you need brake rotors for your next race, which is in, let's say, 2 weeks. And, they're not going to have rotors ready for another 4. Well, now you're kind of sitting dead in the water, right? And I have friends that have found themselves in similar situations like that. And I said, okay, wow, that really sucks. Like that's not something that's ever occurred to me, but seeing that happen with others it was a big sticking point for what was the kind of focus with what we brought to the market.
Yeah. So initially my car was on TLS rotors and calipers. They were machined down, spacers, weird stuff. And for the 8th and 9th gens, to my knowledge, the only kits out there are the TLS. Well, prior to your kit, were the TLS. There's a couple people making different variations, whether they machine the caliper itself or run a spacer on the rotor or run S2000 rotors, which could never be a good idea considering how badly S2000s destroy S2000 rotors.
Funny story. So the 10th gen that I ended up buying was a development car for another company. And the brakes that they had put on that car were DC5 Brembos. And this should also work for an 8th or 9th gen. Highly do not recommend to anybody listening, but they're DC5 Brembos off of a JDM DC5R with S2000 rotors. And as you know, and as probably many other people know, S2000 rotors are notorious for cracking.
Yep.
If you go to a track day and there's more than 3 S2000s there, you're almost guaranteed to see at least one of them replace his rotors sometime during that day. And
in my region, if there's 3 S2000s side by side, there's probably a small mountain of rotors by the end of the weekend.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I'm a good friend of mine, Will Long. He's got an S2000, and I want to say he's got at least half a dozen sets of discarded rotors sitting in his garage right now.
Oh yeah,
but yeah, to go and put that on a car that weighs a bit more than an S2000 and makes more power and more torque,
and is unbalanced,
didn't really make sense to me. And the other thing that's even worse is with those DC5 calipers, on DC5s, they are a trailing configuration caliper. So with the front axle, the caliper sits basically on the back side of the wheel, right? So and with Civics, with 8th, 9th, 10th, and the 11th gens, they're all leading calipers. So those calipers specifically don't have external crossover tubes. So to run that trailing caliper as a leading caliper means that the staggered pistons are run the wrong way. So I actually have a picture on my Facebook of some pads that I took off last year when I was still tracking it on those calipers. And man, those pads they still had maybe half-life left on them, and there was a good 2 or 3 mils taper in them already. It was bad.
So for those that don't understand, can you explain the offset pistons and what it means or how it should be set?
Yeah. So yeah, with staggered caliper pistons, Basically, what that means is when you have a fixed caliper, like a 4-piston caliper or a 6-piston caliper, the caliper pistons themselves will be different sizes. So in each half the caliper, it will use the same size pistons. But if you think about like how the rotor sweeps through the caliper, the first piston that it will pass by is going to be the smallest piston. And then the one after that will be bigger. And if it's a 6-pot, the one after that will be even bigger. And the science behind it is basically as that rotor is turning, you're going to have more torque at the leading edge of the brake pad. So if you put a smaller piston there, you decrease torque at the leading edge. And with a larger piston behind it, you basically even out how that brake pad wears, despite the fact there's a spinning disc running past it, creating friction. And funny enough, actually, it's not something that's done on all calipers. So it is definitely the more correct way to do a multi-piston caliper. But for example, the Civic Type R, their factory caliper just uses 4 40-millimeter pistons. Actually, same thing with the Focus RS2 and a couple other cars out there. Mm-hmm. They are multi-piston calipers from the factory, but they're not staggered. And the only reason for manufacturers really doing that is just to save money. They don't have to get multiple size pistons made. And, right. Same goes for seals and dust boots and all that. It just reduces part count on the car, which it's a pretty big thing from an OEM standpoint. I've worked for a few OEMs now, and cost is king when it comes to making cars, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, but when you step into the world of racing, people and, racing teams and companies tend to be more willing to spend money because that's just kind of how the world goes in racing. So,
yeah, the most viable options, well, I mean, maybe not for the 10th gen, but the 8th and 9th gen were these Brembo retrofits, from the TLS or the Genesis and Genesis. Things like that.
Yep.
Yeah. So you're running into that whole OEM issue, right? Just because it says Brembo on it, it probably means there's quality. There's some quality behind it, but the design's not optimized.
Oh yeah, exactly. So the Genesis swap is pretty popular with 10th gens. And, if you just have a street car and, you're doing it for aesthetic reasons, more power to you. There's nothing wrong with doing a retrofit like that. It serves the purpose. You're really not going to notice too much of a difference. But at the end of the day, you are using something that is intended for another application. And without the ability to modify it, you're just kind of stuck with what you got. So, for example, with the Genesis Brembos, the pistons in those calipers are huge. It pushes brake bias, like I want to say it's been a minute since I've looked at the numbers, but it's like 15 or 20% forward in the car, which is a very significant change. And again, for a street car, you may not notice that, but when you get out on track, you'll definitely notice that. The other thing too,
your pedal's going to travel so far, you have to notice it.
Yeah. The other thing too with that that a lot of people don't totally realize, because it's not really something that gets spelled out on paper, is an OEM fixed caliper. Like your Genesis, your TLS caliper. They're not intended for track use. They can be used on track and they can be made to work. But at the end of the day, it is still a cost compromise to design. And what I mean by that is when you compare the OEM Genesis caliper, for example, to the EBC calipers that we use in our kits, the EBC calipers are cast. They're a low pressure casting. So they're made from a better alloy, but they're all the way that they're manufactured is also superior to an OEM casting. And that's not even going into all of the other obvious advantages, right? That's just in the body itself. So there's things that make these more aftermarket or track focused brake kits superior to an OEM retrofit setup.
Yeah. So let's we sort of jumped ahead, but not really. So there's always been this adage, right, where folks say, "Oh, but your stock brakes will lock up your they'll lock up your tires, so you don't really need a big brake kit." Except for I find that's not necessarily true, especially, let's say, in a more dedicated HPDE. Definitely when you hit time trials, well, maybe not so much in time trials, to be honest. If you're hunting for a 1 to 3 lap goal, but if you're out there lapping the entire time trial session, maybe you need a big brake kit. But definitely racing, you need a big brake kit. So,
oh, absolutely.
Why do people need those? Why do people need a big brake kit?
Yeah, I mean, the what you're getting at with, you know, being out there for a longer amount of time, right? This is something that doesn't necessarily click for a lot of people until they've been tracking for a while. And, you know, that's the heat capacity of the brake system itself, right? So yeah, you know, when you're driving around on the street, your stock calipers can lock up your wheels fine. But when you're on track and you're trying to do that for 20 minutes, basically nonstop, or, you know, ideally nonstop, because nobody wants to waste their time on track doing cool down laps, you know, it's a whole different story, right? So the main components that go into that are largely your pad and your rotor, right? That's where the friction is being made. So how much heat can those handle before one of them gives up, right? If you get rotors that get over-temped, they will start to get pad deposits in them faster. But usually once the rotor over-temps, the pad over-temps. It's kind of a hand-in-hand thing. So the one thing that I normally tell guys they're just getting into tracking is the 3 best things they can do for their car outside of, you know, getting seat time is brakes, tires, and a seat. Mm-hmm. And brakes and tires go hand in hand, right? If you put huge slicks on your car, which would never recommend to someone that's just getting into tracking, but, you know, for sake of example, you know, if you put huge slicks on your car, you don't upgrade the brakes, you're never going to be able to get those tires to lock up. You're never going to get peak grip in braking conditions with those tires, right?
Right.
The opposite is true for brakes as well, right? If you leave your 600 treadwear all seasons or winter tires on your car and you go put a big brake kit on it, you're probably going to have a tough time keeping those tires from locking up. Yep. Right. So there's a balancing aspect in there. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And that's kind of something that I touch on our website. We've got some blog posts. One of them goes over a bunch of different brake pad compounds that are out there, and just kind of how I view the brake compound world and, you know, what is your intended use for the car and here's what I would recommend, sort of thing. But yeah, that's a balancing thing there. And then going back to heat capacity, right? That's something that was a big sticking point in my head with when we were developing our kit for the Civic. Was obviously we don't want to stick to a factory sized rotor. So one of the things, like I mentioned earlier, that was a big focus for the kit was giving the customer the ability to control their consumable costs, which to me means they have to be able to use a one-piece rotor if they don't want to spend a ton of money on rotors, but still have an option to use two-piece rotors if they want to save weight, right? And the only way to really do that without going out and spending a bunch of money getting custom rotors cast and all that is to use rotors from another car.
Right.
So, you know, I don't know if you want to talk about the kit that's on your car or not, but
yeah, we can.
You know, when you first reached out to me, the initial direction we had gone was using an Evo 8.9 rotor with an AP Racing CP8350 caliper, which for those who are not familiar, if you look up like AP Racing brake kit, it'll probably be the first picture of a caliper you see. It's an extremely common caliper out there that a lot of kits use. It's a great caliper. And that was just kind of like the after doing the numbers, the math for figuring out piston area and rotor diameters and centers to get see what the bias change would be. It wasn't a huge impact on bias, which was good. That's where we wanted to be. It allowed for 17-inch wheels to still be used because in Civic World, a lot of guys track on 17s. So I didn't want to use something that was so huge it would force guys to have to use 18s. And
I appreciate that.
I actually, funny enough, my car is on 18s, and I've debated more than a couple times going down to 17s. But anyway, that was kind of where I started with, and there wasn't really too much of a rhyme or reason for choosing the Evo rotors other than it was what I was familiar with. I have a background working with Evos, and I don't know of really anybody that's had issues with stock Evo rotors as far as, not being track capable.
Right.
So ultimately, we ended up moving away from that direction for a few reasons. We ended up changing the caliper and the rotor, which is obviously what the majority of the kit is. So like I said, that CP83 50 caliper, it's a great caliper. Unfortunately, we don't have it's kind of annoying. It's cumbersome for us to source those calipers. There's only a few sales channels in the US you can get them through. And they're also not the most budget oriented caliper. Again, great caliper, but they're a pretty penny for what they are.
Yeah.
And
it seemed to me like they were coming in twice a year on a ship.
Yeah, I mean, you're very well aware. I mean, it took, I want to say it took about 6 months for us to get calipers.
Yeah.
And when we ordered a few kits or a few sets for the prototypes that we had, and it was like, well, if this is how it's always going to be, this is just straight up not going to work for a product that we're trying to sell to other people.
Right.
And then as far as the rotor goes, we ended up moving away from the Evo rotor. We could have stayed with the Evo rotor, honestly, but we ended up changing to use a 350Z rotor. It still is another great rotor option. It's a very similar size, but ultimately we ended up going with the Z rotor over the Evo rotor because it's a taller height, so it pulls the friction surface further inboard, which ultimately gives you better wheel clearance with spokes.
Yeah, you did an open casting call. That's twice that I've won the open casting call lottery. So I appreciate you selecting me to help try to figure this out. I think one of the first things I wanted was to make sure it was based on an OEM caliper because of the availability. When we're at the track, you never know what's going to happen.
You mean rotor?
Yeah, rotor. Sorry. Yeah, an OEM rotor. Because things happen, right? And I need to go to AutoZone, O'Reilly's, Advanced, whatever the local place is, and find a replacement.
Yep.
I'm not throwing away
I've
a weekend.
seen that plenty before.
Yeah. So.
I mean, nobody wants to have their race weekend ruined over something as simple as a brake rotor, right? And even in the case where, like you were saying before we started recording, you're running these really nice DBA 2-piece rotors on your car, but they're as good of a rotor as they are. That doesn't mean they're not going to wear out at some point, and you never really know when that point is going to be. I'm sure you have your pre-race inspections where, the week before, a few days before you have your race weekend, you're checking the car over and making sure it's good before you go race. But, not everything always gets caught. And it's nice to have that fallback option of, oh man, one of my DBAs cracked after qualifying or practice, but I can run down to AutoZone, get some one-piece rotors, and that will tie me over for the weekend, right?
Yeah. It's not optimal, right? You don't want that added weight. the bonus of the two piece is it's always lighter, right? But you're either going to throw away the rest of your weekend or you're going to run heavy rotors. I can run heavier rotors. That's fine. You know?
Yeah. Actually, so I figured actually this is a good time to kind of touch on that. So one piece versus two piece stuff. Obviously, one piece rotors are good. They serve the purpose. They do the job. Two piece are better. Usually, a lot of people see them main advantage as shaving weight, which in many cases is a very good advantage. But when you get into the higher end of two piece rotors, you get into what's called a floating rotor. Mm-hmm. And it's if you're kind of familiar, it's also common on a lot of like motorcycles or pedal bikes too. But basically how floating rotors work is that you have a two piece rotor and the friction ring is retained to the center hat, but it is not affixed to it. So there are still bolts that hold it on there, but there is basically like some amount of play between the center hat and the ring. And that's basically there to allow for thermal expansion. So when you have a non-floating two-piece rotor or a one-piece rotor, as that rotor gets hot and expands, it will actually start to kind of cup is a term I've heard engineers call it, but basically cupping is that rotor face kind of bending away from the center hat. So it's not too common. You really see huge issues with cupping. It's really more an issue when you get into high levels of motorsport, right? Cars that are like, for example, NASCAR, right? A car that weighs 3,000 pounds or less and it's making 700 horsepower and it's being raced for a couple hours at a time, right? That's a case where, you know, cupping could cause really dramatically bad pad wear. And that's another thing too, right? It's not necessarily going to be an issue that you notice in your brake pedal. So it may not really affect performance much, but if it's a car that's being raced for hours in an enduro or, you know, a longer sprint race, you know, obviously nobody wants to have issues with bad wear because that's wasting money. So.
Yeah. My biggest thing was, at least for the DBAs, going with the DBAs was price and the build. So the build of the two-piece was not different, but more robust, let's say. They're not the lightest two-piece rotor I could have gone with. There were a couple of other options that were several pounds lighter, but they seemed more flimsy. And I knew what I was doing.
I mean, that's yeah, I mean, you know, this is, again, something that we were talking a bit about before we started recording, right? Just because there's a two-piece rotor, there's multiple two-piece rotors, doesn't mean that they're all the same. Obviously, you could have floating versus non-floating, but even in markets where you have floating, multiple floating options or multiple non-floating options, you know, there is obviously a rotor at the end of the day is a chunk of metal, but there is a lot of science that goes into metallurgy. And, you know, obviously when you're talking about a friction ring or, you know, the iron part of a two-piece rotor, what the actual alloy that's used and how it's cast, right? It can be a huge difference in how that rotor performs and how long it lasts. That's something that actually not a lot of people realize is when you start getting into more of the race grade two-piece rotors, the iron that is used for those friction rings is considerably more robust than your one-piece rotor that you can go get from AutoZone. It is a much more harder iron. Well, not necessarily hard. Again, there's a lot of factors of metallurgy that go into it, but for racing uses, what you get lasts considerably longer, despite it being the same shape and dimensions.
So let's enter a little bit of a debate. When you're looking to buy a brake kit, are you looking for thermal mass in your rotor, or are you looking for weight savings in your rotor? Because when we talked about the kit initially, that's on my car, the Evo 8-9 rotor with the AP caliper, that I dropped like 15 pounds a corner with that setup. I was ecstatic. Now, I didn't have any thermal issues. Neither of my cars and none of the brake setups that I've owned, and I've owned multiple brake setups on both of the cars now, I've never ducted mine. I've never needed to duct mine. So,
yeah, that's yeah. So I'm not a huge proponent for brake ducting either. It's kind of it's a situational thing, right? There are a lot of guys that are quick to go throw ducts on their car, and they may not necessarily need it. And it's not a bad thing to have, but sorry, I realize I'm getting a bit off topic here. I'll go back to your original debate question in a sec, but yeah, so like ducting, it's really it's most applicable for cars that are being driven for extended periods of time on track, but normally that's intended for situations where the thermal capacity of the system may not be up to the task, right? So, for example, when you look at NASCAR stuff, right, older NASCARs use rotors like a road course rotor, for example. You know, the largest brake package you're going to see on a NASCAR. It's a 330 by 40 or 42 millimeter rotor. It's a small diameter, right? In a car that weighs 3,000 to 3,200 pounds, making 700 to 750 horsepower. It's not a lot of brake to stop a very fast moving chunk of metal. So they run
for 2 to 3 hours.
2 or 3. Yeah. But on those cars, they also run 2 to 3 ducts per corner.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. They have a ton of airflow going to those brakes to keep them in a zone where they can live. If you look at like a lot of like IMSA cars, right, like GTD or GTLM or whatever they call those classes nowadays, right? Those cars are running larger wheels so they can fit larger brakes. So, you know, instead of a 330 millimeter rotor, maybe it's a 380 or a 400 millimeter rotor.
Yes.
And you know, that adds a ton of thermal capacity, right? Because that's just kind of how circle math works. As the circle gets bigger, your area and your volume grows exponentially. So, yeah, but going back to your original debate question, when I look at brake kits, am I looking for mass reduction or thermal capacity? In a perfect world, I'm looking for both. Obviously, shedding as much weight as you can is always preferred. If I can only pick one, or if I had to lean heavier in one direction, it would be towards thermal capacity. And this is mainly my personal preference. Obviously, you know, the application, you know, the intended purpose for each person's situation will drive a different answer. But one of the reasons that I don't run brake ducts on my car is I don't like dealing with them, right? It gets in the way. If if you're working in the wheel well, it's one more thing you got to contend with, right? You got to make sure it's not getting hit by suspension components or axles. And, you know, it's another thing to have on the car. And if you don't need it, it's one less thing you got to think about. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize with brake ducts is they actually add drag, right? So when you're getting into certain classes where the rule, you know, the sandbox isn't big, the rule set's pretty tight. You know, if you can avoid adding aerodynamic drag to your car, then by all means, you know, don't add drag to the car. And not having ducts helps reduce drag a bit. So, but the way I see it is, you know, motorsports is inherently expensive. And if I'm paying my own money to do it, I don't want to have to worry about babying the car, right? I want to drive the car as hard as I can for as long as I can. And if it goes a few, minuscule amount of time slower because it's got a few extra pounds of weight in the brakes, that's not the end of the world to me. I just want to be able to drive the damn car, right?
Right. The other thing I have, my biggest pet peeve with brake ducts is when I see them snaked. There's 30 bends to get to the brake duct. That's the most inefficient way to move air. You're worried about drag. Forget drag. They put so many bends in there, it's not even working.
Yeah, there's actually a funny thing, right? So if you go look at the Evo market, I don't think anybody sells brake ducts anymore for those cars, at least for the 8s or 9s. Back in the day when there were ducting options, I think the biggest duct was a 2-inch duct, which is just a 2-inch brake hose is hilariously small. If you put it side by side against a 3-inch hose, a 3-inch hose is like over twice the area. And so that's another thing too, right? Space becomes a premium. The only applications where you really see ducting done really well, that outside of like professional motorsports, is a few OEM applications. So, for example, Corvettes have some really well done OEM ducting, but it's not just, we shoved a hose to the backside of the bumper and then, like you said, bent it 5, 6, or 18 times to get it to the spindle. They have an area on the bumper that pulls in air, and there is a formed tube that gets bolted to the frame rail, and it's a system of parts. Right. To do ducting well, right? Doing ducting is one thing. Doing ducting well is another thing, and there is definitely a fair amount of thought and engineering that has to go into it to do it well.
Yeah. So the bonus, I think, with your kit is versus even I can ignore the stock calipers, because on especially the 10th gen SIs, from the 8th gen to the 10th gen SIs, they were horribly underbrake from the factory. They had tiny, terrible brakes. Terrible. Okay. So you can't even weigh that caliper and go, well, I want my caliper to be at least this light, right? You have to get rid of it. It was so terrible. You can't, it's not even on the field of play, right? So when you start looking at all the kits out there, you have to toss out all the Brembos, because the Brembos are, they're heavier than the original brake, right? And the performance stuff, the EBC caliper that you ended up going with, the AP, almost any other option is lighter. And then you can save that weight, and then you will end up with some more rotating mass, but it's the right kind of mass. It's the one that's going to save you from breaking things like breaking your rotor. It's going to hold up. We do 40-minute races on Sundays in our class, and I beat on the brakes every single time. I just beat on them. It doesn't matter. And they held up, So.
Yeah. I mean, so kind of going back to that for a sec. I mean, like I talked about earlier, right? Not just because you have 2 4-piston calipers doesn't mean that they're equal. And that couldn't be more true when you're comparing an OEM Brembo style to either the EBC caliper you use or the AP caliper that's on your car. And there is a slew of differences, right? So some of the most obvious ones, right? There's stainless steel pistons in most aftermarket ones. And OEM calipers will almost always come with aluminum pistons, right? So stainless steel, for those not familiar with metallurgy, stainless steel has a lower thermal conductivity. And so what that means is it acts as a better heat barrier. So your brake fluid will last longer before it starts to boil with a stainless piston versus an aluminum piston. Another thing that happens is when you move into most aftermarket brake kits, they don't use dust boots. The main reason being, dust boots are good. They keep seals and pistons looking nice and from getting damaged by debris and corrosion and dirt, but they don't handle heat. I wish I could show you a picture. Actually, I don't know if I still have the picture. I took a picture of the dust boots that I took off of those DC5 calipers when I took them off the car, and there was just nothing left. They just disintegrated from the heat. And you could run an OEM caliper without any dust boot, but the problem is there's a cavity there that is supposed to be occupied by a boot, and it ends up getting packed in with dirt and brake dust. And now you end up basically shooting yourself in the foot because, the reason for not having dust boots is or well, I guess it just doesn't work. The boots, after they melt,
they're useless.
There has to be something else that fills there, and it's a
mess.
So it becomes a huge issue. I mean, if you start leaking brake fluid past your piston seals, you don't have brakes, right? And that's a worst case scenario, especially when you're on track. So avoiding situations like that is definitely ideal. And actually another reason that we ended up switching to the EBC calipers over the AP is the EBC calipers are offered in two configurations. So they have what we call a street caliper and a track caliper. So the two topics that I actually just talked about are the two main differences between the street and track versions of the EBC calipers. So their track caliper is just like your AP caliper. It is it's an unpainted but hard anodized finish. So it's gray on the exterior of the caliper. It's not damaged by heat, and it isn't hurt by brake fluid or anything like that. So the caliper stays looking nice over time, even when it's seeing a bunch of heat on track. But it has stainless steel pistons, and it doesn't have dust boots. The street caliper is painted. They come in 4 different colors. They do have dust boots, and they use aluminum pistons. And, one of the things that I kind of quickly realized after we started developing the kit was there's going to be a lot of guys that either don't track their cars, right? And they want to do a big brake upgrade for aesthetic reasons. Or, for example, that maybe they have a car kind of like how I use our development car, right? I still daily drive that car, but I still want to take it to the track, right? And so living in the Midwest, we get winters, we get road salt. I still drive that car down dirt roads and stuff from time to time, and I don't want to have to worry about, anything getting in between the caliper body and the piston and damaging a seal or anything like that. So for me, I run the street calipers on our development car, and even despite us calling them, or me calling them, a street caliper, they are still worlds better than an OEM Brembo caliper. The body itself of the caliper is still hard anodized. They just paint over it. There is a bridge bolt. So, for example, it's the same thing with your AP caliper. You have what's called a pad bridge or a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that sleeve and that bolt that go over the top of the pads. And it's a multi-purpose function. One, it serves to retain the pads, right? So when you go to change your pads, you pull that bolt out, you pull the sleeve out, and then you can change the pads from the top side. With an OEM caliper, that there is no bridge there. There's just some pins that hold the pads into the caliper, but that bolt helps to stiffen the top side of the caliper. Right. If you just have an open space across the top of the caliper, there's nothing to stiffen it. And that's one of the reasons why you see aftermarket calipers be stiffer than OEM calipers, right? It's a better casting, and it has more bolts going through it to hold it together. So it deflects less under hard braking. Other stuff that's better about it, Well, like we talked about in the beginning, the bias is actually set up right. So the piston area for the AP and the EBC caliper are both about as correct as it can be for the factory brake bias on Civics. So back when I developed the kit, the math behind it, it was like a 2% or 1.5% bias change. And it will vary depending on the generation. It's like a 2% change for the 10th gen. I think it was like about the same for the 8th, and the 9th was a little bit more. I think the 9th was like 3 or 4% or maybe 5. I don't remember. But yeah, I mean, it is a more correct application of parts versus just retrofitting OEM brakes from another application onto your car.
Yeah. And it's a caliper that's readily available on a OEM based rotor. And that is the best of both worlds to me. And an OEM rotor that comes in multiple companies make 2 pieces for us fancy boys, you know?
Yep. Yeah. And the other thing too, that was kind of like the final decision for swapping the AP caliper for the EBC caliper, was pads. So the AP caliper uses a very common pad shape, and basically any track compound under the sun you can think of, you can get in that pad shape. But again, going back to there's going to be a lot of people that are street driving on these brakes. There's really not a lot of street compounds available in that pad shape. And the EBC caliper uses a different pad shape, and that pad shape has all the EBC street compounds, the greens, the reds, I don't know if they make the greens anymore, but the reds, the yellows, the oranges, and as well as Hawk street compounds. I mean, all of like the aftermarket brake companies that you know of that make street compounds, you can get in these EBC pad shapes. So it really just kind of felt like we were making something that was ultimately more versatile and appealed to a larger market. So, and of course all the other reasons.
Yeah. Well, and to me, the biggest reason when you announce the change, the price is, I mean, there's no reason not to get this kit. When you look at what the price is for TLS stuff was or Genesis stuff was, and then you figure in, well, you got to get stuff recoded because all that stuff's beat. You know, you're buying your calipers on eBay, and then you go, oh, well, I'm going to get rotors and this and that, whatever. The price point that you have that kit coming out at it's amazing. That's a great price. So kudos to you.
Yeah. I mean, thank you. We definitely kind of, there was a lot of back work involved to get everything kind of figured out as far as like, you know, I still got to make money selling these things, but you know, I do want to be able to offer a good option for the community that isn't going to be, you know, something that breaks the bank. And, you know, these EBC calipers, we can source them easier, but ultimately they do cost less than the AP caliper, which was, you know, the largest driving factor behind why the production kit we sell now was cheaper than the numbers I had told you when we started developing the prototypes with the AP calipers. And it's yeah, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, you could probably put together a Genesis or a TLS kit for a little less money, but like you said, you know, you're going to have to find used calipers, and if you want it to look nice, you're going to have to get them recoded, and there's so much more work involved and so many more steps to get an inferior product for a little bit less money, right? And the other thing too that I wouldn't expect a lot of people to realize is, you with aluminum, it has a limited life cycle, right? For a street car, this isn't something that would ever really apply. But when you're talking track cars, every time your brakes get thermal cycled, it's one more heat cycle on them, dirt to dirt. But they can only really do so many heat cycles before the metal itself starts to soften, right? And so if you're buying used TLS or Genesis brakes, you're buying calipers that already have heat cycles on them.
Yep.
Versus if you buy a new kit from us, they're brand new calipers. They've not been heat cycled. And again, they're made from a better alloy that can take more heat cycles overall. So it's, I don't want this to come off as like, when you heat cycle out your brakes and they're going to fail and explode. But I've seen a few cases. It is nothing like that, but I've seen a few cases where guys run into, I've had this TLS kit on my car for 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. And, I'm starting to get like really, really bad taper in my brake pads, and like there's nothing wrong, right? Like my wheel bearings aren't bad. There's nothing wrong with the suspension. Everything feels okay when I'm using them on track, but I'm getting bad wear. And it's like, well, if they've been on the car for long enough, you may just need to replace the calipers. If they've been heat cycled out, they're getting soft. Yeah. And once they get up to temp, they're just not holding the pads how they're supposed to.
Yep. I've seen really, really old calipers start to have issues with retaining the seals on the actual pistons because the pistons they're distorting. They've distorted over time. All those different heat cycles. You replace the pistons, you replace the seals, and it's generally good to go. There's so many problems you can have, and really, I think your price point is maybe $200 or $300 above what a TLS kit refinished will cost you. That's really not that much more to have a more superior product, at least for the 8th and 9th gens. There's plenty of folks, plenty of chassis. Everybody needs a brake kit. And if sort of to wrap up, when we go back to the beginning, you talked about you recommend people get brakes, tires, and seats, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the brakes and the tires are related, as we talked about before. You start bumping up to the 200 treadwears, especially the cheater 200 treadwears, you're gonna want better brakes. Sure, maybe your factory 100%. Brakes are gonna be okay with some fluid and a different compound pad. You have a very extensive list of pads. I think you're underrating my ST43s. I think they're a little more aggressive than you give them credit for, but you have an extensive list on your website. That's a great piece of information. But once you start down that path, you will end up at a point where even on 200 treadwears, your stock brakes just aren't going to cut it. So when you're looking for thermal capacity, you're looking not necessarily to shorten the distance, but to create consistency over time. I think that's when you really want to look for a big brake kit, a bigger brake kit.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the thermal capacity is a huge side of it. And as well, especially when you're talking about the Civics in particular, where you're upgrading from a single piston sliding brake setup from the factory. You're also talking about cutting down on consumable cost as far as pads go, right? Because like you were saying, if you put a Super 200 or Cheater 200 treadwear tire on your car with those single piston calipers, I can guarantee that you will have some very terrible pad taper. You're going to be throwing out pads well before part of the pad has been used to its fullest, or
you're going to have compromised braking. if you don't check it and you don't look, you're going to be like, my brakes suck. Well, yeah.
I mean, there's, I mean, even, the performance aspect of it is night and day. But I mean, I've seen it even with, we have a pretty, well, I like to think that we have a pretty good presence on the 10th Gen Civic forum. And, I've seen a few guys post on there, well, like, hey, I've got my stock brakes, I'm not ready to pony up for a big brake kit yet. And, they've done maybe a handful of track days, and, they're hey, I've started to notice, like, even on these 300 treadwear tires, like, I'm getting some not great pad wear, like I'm, there's still a few millimeters left on part of the pad, and the other half of the pad is gone. And, well, it's just one of those things. Would you rather have one set of pads last you an entire season, or maybe you're going to have to use 2 or 3 sets of pads to get you through a season, right? And when you're talking racing compounds, those pads aren't, the cheap $30 organic pads you can get at AutoZone, right? You're forking out a couple $100 every time you got to buy pads, regardless of what the shape is,
Yep. Part of my pad decisions is made on how long they last versus the price. And I get a lot of heat because they're like, oh, your pads are $300. Yes. But I run them for the entire season, and then I can take them off, put them in a box as backups, because you never know. Sometimes a pad batch is bad and they just disintegrate. They have an issue. So I have a backup set, right? For $300. On my old pads, the old pads I used to run, it was $180 every 2 events. That adds up. That's way more than $300. Oh, so
I have a few years ago, it's probably 21 maybe or so. I met a friend at the track who was running Carbon Lorraine pads on his car. Specifically, I think there were RC6E pads. They're endurance pads, and they're a sintered pad. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, I'd never heard of a manufacturer making sintered pads for cars. It's very common in the motorcycle world, but I'd never heard of it for cars. And he was like, yeah, they're like $400 or $450 an axle, right? To do all 4 corners, you're talking $800 or $900 for pads. But, I only go through like a third of the pad in a season.
Okay.
And it's like, oh, well, okay. I mean, when you put it like that, that's not too bad. And actually, EBC has 2 sintered compounds now as well. They're SR21 and they're SR11. And 2 of the things that they really promote with their marketing material on those compounds is they're not hard on rotors and they last a long time. And crazy enough, they're not absurdly expensive. They're not to the price point of as cheap as some of the Hawk stuff that's out there, but they're certainly not as expensive as those CL pads are. And I'm going to deviate here for a sec. I'm sure there's a lot of people that may be listening that are scoffing, oh, how could they be using EBC products and this, that, and the other? I can't tell you how many times in the past 6 months I've heard guys go, I ran yellows on my car one time and they fell apart on track. And it's unfortunate that EBC has kind of gained this reputation that they have right now. Mm-hmm. A couple of years ago, they started about a year and a half ago, they started their a separate division called EBC Racing, and they've come out with 4 different pad compounds, all of these calipers, including the calipers that we use in our kits, as well as their own dedicated kits for a few different platforms, and replacement 2-piece rotors for certain applications. I don't think they have an 8-9 rotor replacement yet, but like they've really turned their ship around as far as the product that they're offering. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of pushback on the market from guys that don't know better. But they've done their homework. The engineering that they've put into their products is right up there with all of the other big names. I honestly, I'm worried I'm going to start pushing this too hard and they're going to start getting more expensive, because what you get for what you pay is bar none. Their pads are like I said, they have 4 new compounds. There's the 2 sintered compounds I talked about, and then they have 2 non-sintered compounds, which are the RP1 and the RPX. And their RP compounds are right on par with Hawk pricing, basically. And everyone I know that preaches Hawk stuff, well, not everyone, but most people I know that run Hawk stuff because it's either all they've ever run or it's cheaper than everyone else. And I like trying different things, so I was totally on board to try EBC's RP compounds, and they've done great so far. I can just say that I've yet to have an issue with them on track, and I'm not the biggest fan of Hawk. They're good pads. They work well. They're priced well, but they're very dusty, and the dust is very acidic. Mm-hmm. I've personally had to refinish multiple sets of wheels because of Hawk dust. And it's just, the mindset of either I'm using these because they're cheaper, or, I haven't had an issue with them. Why should I use anything else? Neither of those mindsets really are good reasons or, justifications to me. So, yeah, if you're listening to this and, it all sounds interesting, go look up EBC's new compounds, RP1, RPX, SR11, or SR21. They're all very, very track capable compounds. I'd recommend them to anyone.
I won't lie, I'm a skeptic, because I grew up in the era where they had their downfall. I'm a motorcycle kid too. So for the longest time, that's the only brake pads we could get our hands on pretty easily. And we started having problems in the motorcycle world, and we searched high and low for anything but EBC. So,
I mean, don't get me wrong. I was a skeptic at first too. But I ended up talking with their, one of their technical directors at PRI this past December, and holding the products in my hands, right? That was kind of like, after I talked with them at PRI, was like, yep, this is definitely the caliper we're going to use for the kits, right? Like the seeing and talking with them and hearing, they were saying the right things, right? They knew what they were talking about. There was no doubt that this was a bad product. And now I've done a few track days with them, and no regrets whatsoever. I mean, it really is amazing that they're offering what they are offering at the price point they are. So,
yeah. So my turn to go down a rabbit hole that's not on the outline that we talked about, because you mentioned it a couple minutes ago. You mentioned that the guy had, he was running special brakes front and rear. What kind of bias do you think needs to be run front and rear for brake pads? Because I'll be honest, I run the cheapest AutoZones in the rear, or advanced, and I run whatever I want in the front.
Yeah, that is a very common mindset for a lot of front-wheel drive guys. I am more than happy to raise my hand and say I've been guilty of doing that. But the only thing I can say for certain, it is very driver dependent. It's very setup dependent. Personally, I like running a stagger on compounds. It works well with how I drive.
So are you still running a lighter rear compound than the front?
Yes. So for example, even on my Evo, when I last had that car running, I was running G-Lock pads on it. I had R16s in the front and R12s in the rear. It mainly stems back to the fact of if you have too little grab in the rear, it's not going to hurt you too much. If you have too much, you're going to know it, right? Mainly in the fact that you're going to be fighting to keep the car from spinning and braking. And on the flip side of that, it's better to err on the side of too little rear brake, but I also don't believe in having no rear brake. And that is kind of where I feel running whatever Duralast Gold pad or whatever pad you can get your hands on for the rear.
Guilty.
Yeah. And so last year with the Civic, when we had the DC5 brakes on it, I ran power stop pads on all four corners, and power stop pads on all four corners. For those not familiar, power stop has two track capable compounds. They're literally called Track Day and Track Day Spec. And they work well. They're outrageously cheap for being a brake pad that you can use on track with a good amount of confidence. They're certainly not the be all end all. I would never recommend them to Yukon because they probably wouldn't last. They might last one race. They're not the longest life pad, but they can handle the heat, and they are exceptionally cheap. But I ended up running out of rear pad at Colorado when I was out there last year with Grid Life, and for some reason, when I did my pre-race or my pre-event inspection the week before, I guess I just forgot to look at my rear pads. And after the first day, I was on the backing plate, and I ended up the only option I had that was local was Duralast Gold pads, and I ended up going faster. Funny enough, I don't think it was the brakes though. I don't think it was the brakes were going faster. I think it was me just driving better. Yeah. I was kind of driving like crap the whole weekend, and then I just made it. I put together a decent lap on the last day. But so for example, right now with the Civic, I still have those Duralast gold pads in the rear. I've been running them with RP1 fronts. I have a set of EBC blues for the rear that I have been itching to put on. But I haven't put them on because when I got into the backing plate with those power stop pads last year, I ended up tearing up the rotor, and I don't want to put good pads on trashed rotors, and I haven't replaced those rear rotors yet. So, I'm expecting
to them. It's fine.
It will, but it doesn't bode well for wear in the long term. When you start putting new pads on rotors that have some pretty decent grooving in them.
Yeah, no, it's a joke. Just like
I know.
But you don't use the rear brakes anyway. It doesn't matter.
I have had people actually say that to me with a serious face before. And like part of me is like, yeah, you're not wrong, but also if you know how to do the thing the right way, then do the thing the right way, So but yeah, I mean, it's certainly an interesting topic. And again, right, this is there is a certain amount of relevance here, right? So for front wheel drive cars, you're not really gonna need a whole ton of brake in the rear. It's actually funny how many 10th gen guys are like, oh, well, can you make a rear big brake kit? And it's like, yeah, we could, but there's really just no point, right?
They need matching fancy brakes.
Of course. That's the only way you can win a car show. I think maybe.
I don't know.
But when you start stepping in the world of Mustangs or M3s or something like that, like a heavier rear-wheel drive car, those cars need a fair bit more rear brake because they have a much larger rear tire. Right. Again, it goes back to the whole your brakes have to match your tires. And I run a reverse stagger setup on my Civic. So we've got a 255 in the front and a 235 in the rear. And, I'm not going to go throwing a big brake kit on the rear of my car when I've got way more tire up front.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we're well past an hour, which is
I was going to say I know I went on a lot of tangents. I wasn't sure how long you wanted to run this for, but I definitely think that we covered just about everything I think anybody could ever want to ask about brake kits.
Awesome. I don't have any more questions, that's for sure. Well, except for where can folks find you in the shop online? I'm sure there's going to be folks that go, hey, we need to make something. Can you make me this? Can you make me that?
Yeah.
And let's.
So we have a Facebook page, we have an Instagram, we have a website. If you use the contact form on the website or you send an email to the email that's on the website, it will go to my email. Check that every day. I try to check the Facebook and Instagram every day, but again, the whole only 24 hours in a day thing. So easiest way is email if you're trying to get a hold of me. And, if you have a Civic and you've got an idea for a product, feel free to reach out. We always get people that are curious about getting parts made. And, unfortunately, as much as I would love to make everybody everything they want, it's got to have a good business case behind it. But there is, there's been a few times people come to me and they've had real good ideas and it makes sense. And, doesn't hurt to reach out. So, but yeah, if you're local to the Chicago area, we're based out of the west suburbs. The shop is over in Brookfield, and a couple times a year we'll have a dyno day. So if you're ever wanting to get your car dynoed and see what it makes, or just come hang out, we usually post those on our socials. So
sweet. I appreciate you coming on. I may have a BRZ driver for you if you want to prototype some parts. He's stupid fast, so
yeah, it's definitely something that we've talked about. It's a platform I would certainly like to do parts for. So, and thank you for having me on. It's I always enjoy nerding out, talking about race car stuff with people.
Until next time, keep working on yourself, keep working on the car, and let's get faster.